knowledge you'd like to impart to those willing to learn? Have you ever listened to our shows and thought, hey, I could do this, but you just don't know how to kickstart
There is
your
one
hosting
other
ambitions?
participant in the
Or
conference.
Are you an
The recording
established
has
professional
started.
host, thwarted by censorship in other areas, seeking pastures new? Contact us here at the world's #1 free speech network, Revolution Radio. We provide the platform, the training, and the airtime to any budding host wanting the chance to take those first talk show steps. Established hosts can find a safe and secure home here, where their message can ring out loud and clear, unencumbered, free from sponsorship overreach. Drop us a line via our email, support@revolution.radio, or head into our Discord server to say hello. We'll take everything from there. Revolution Radio, where hosting dreams become actualized reality.
The rooster has crowed out the opening bars of a new day. You've dragged yourself out of bed. You turn on your device. You want to know what's going on in the world. But you're hungry for a topical show that serves up those breakfast headlines just that little bit differently. Do you like your early morning news the way you like your eggs over easy? Served with slathers of salsa-like sass? Do you like those first headlines of the day to deliver a punch as powerful as that first cup of joe? Join Mitchell Bupp at his breakfast table for Revolution in the Morning, where he will digest, dissect, and dismantle those new day's national and global news headlines with razor-sharp relish. Find Mitchell here at revolution.radio every Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday morning, 8 to 10 a.m. Eastern on Studio B.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Hello, everyone. I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. This broadcast here on Revolution Radio is Apoc On Aire, and this is where we sew together events in the news, humanities, and history, literature, and all of these good things, hoping to provide a deeper insight to the events of the day. The past few weeks, we've been looking at the close of the First World War and the international structure set up since then. And, well, we're living at the end of that now, and we can get into significances after World War II and all this sort of thing. But anyway, this largely depends on whether we consider the First and Second World Wars two distinct events, or ought we consider them one large event, and therefore the geopolitics coming out of the whole period from the 1920s through the late 1940s is itself one single event? We'll talk about all of that. But here we are on Revolution Radio, 10 o'clock Eastern Time each Monday. By the way, this station is listener-supported, so please, if you have the means, help out Revolution Radio. They do a great deal of work getting voices out there that you certainly wouldn't get in the mainstream, and they have a fine archive that's freely available online and all sorts of good things, so do help them out. All right. Now, we do have a poem queued up as we're wont to do. We're a month broadcasting, thank God, and hopefully getting better and better in all sorts of ways, including audio quality. So we do have a poem anyway coming up, and I'm going to put that a little bit later into the show just to make it topically appropriate to the situation after the Treaty of Paris, which we looked at last week with Woodrow Wilson and the 14 points, the failure of that to obtain here in these United States, ironically. In other words, America does not join the League of Nations that the American President Wilson so rallied for. We'll get into all that. But first things first, our news item for today is looking at funding, and it's entitled, "What is the Mellon Foundation Doing to Higher Education?" Always follow the money trail, the money coin crumb trail. I guess Bitcoin crumb trail these days, whatever money is, I don't know. All right, so this is from The Atlantic, which is a certainly venerable American publication. I don't agree with all of their editorial policy, but it does go back, I believe, before the American Civil War. It's one of the oldest publications. Anyway, what's the Mellon Foundation doing in the humanities? If you're not familiar, the humanities deals with all of those disciplines, history, literature, languages, philosophy, religion, art, architecture, all of that human stuff, all of that stuff that nobody cares about in education. But anyway, in 1964, we begin. An influential report identified a disquieting trend in academia. Quote, increasingly during the past 2 years, concern has been expressed about the condition in this country of those fields of intellectual activity generally called the humanities. The 200-plus page document was a publication of the National Commission on the Humanities, which had been established the previous year. Reading the Commission's findings 6 decades later, one could reasonably conclude that what today gets called a crisis of the humanities is not so much a discrete 21st century emergency as the latest expression of an educational catastrophe long in the making. I need to interject here because you're normal people and you don't think about educational history as much as I do. And you have to consider something, and that is before the mid-19th century, college education was exclusively given to disciplines already listed that we call the humanities. There were no technical sciences. In fact, one of the real pivotal events in educational history in these United States is the teaching of Italian and German at Harvard University in the 1850s. So this is 100 years before this report came out. And interestingly, the Italian professor was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who went on to do a very nice translation of the Commedia Divina of Dante Alighieri during the Civil War, which is a whole other layer of meditation to the poem when you realize. Anyway, Longfellow and his advocates wanted to teach these modern languages, in order to access a lot of the intellectual ferment of Europe at that time. And there was a huge fight. There was a huge fight in the American colleges, including especially in Harvard, over this. And the consciousness was that if we allow one modern topic, that is to say modern living languages, to be taught, that is, less hours in the day we could be studying the classics. The prior orientation was exclusively on the past. To be educated meant to master classical texts and classical languages. And the thinking went, and here we are, this was absolutely on the nose. If we allow a modern discipline to come in and slowly, even imperceptibly crowd out the true classical orientation of colleges, and when I say that classical, I mean in the ancient world, if we allow that to shift, Katie bar the door. There's nothing stopping the entirety of academia, inch by inch, from being completely dominated by modern concerns, and you end up unmooring yourself from the sweep of history, which is exactly what happened. And here we are now in the 21st century, and we're seeing whole departments being merged, if they're not being shut down altogether, in favor of the so-called STEM fields and marketable fields. So the entire soul of academia has been lost. Anyway, let's keep reading here. So this is what we're reading here about 1964. This is like a midway point in, as the editors say, the educational catastrophe long in the making. The challenges outlined in 1964 are familiar: meager funding, insufficient support for graduate students, too few faculty jobs, an education system that glamorizes science and math, dense writing that alienates the public, and so forth. That's another thing that was actually happening exactly in 1964. In America, is you have the baby boomers are getting to be college age. In Europe, they come up with kind of a lottery system. In America, market-driven America, we just build more colleges. And there are two completely different psychologies there. They both have problems, but as it regards the American situation, what ends up happening at exactly this time, the mid-1960s, until today, is that by opening the doors to colleges and opening more college doors and building more colleges, you've now made higher education access a democratic thing, which is very American, I suppose. But you've also flooded academia with millions and millions of people who really don't have the type of, well, if you forgive me, aristocratic understanding of what the university's role is. And what you end up with is the bourgeois who are sending their children to colleges just want their children to get good jobs out of it at the end of the day. And that completely changes the ethos, just as this very essay was going to press. It goes on, quote, "The state of the humanities today, 1964, creates a crisis. There is a genuine doubt today whether the universities and colleges can ensure that the purposes for which they were established and sometimes endowed will be fulfilled." This doubt was and has not much diminished in the intervening decades, nor have the problems the report identified gone by the wayside. Yet what is more notable in the report is not these similarities, but the Commission's prescient fear that the solutions to what ailed the humanities, namely more cash and large-scale institutional support, also carried risks. Quote, "For the very reason that the humanities are concerned with quality, with values, with emotions, and with the goals of living, they must remain free. To control them is to dictate opinion and to subject all men to the tyranny of a controlling authority in the most intimate and sacred concerns of our existence as human beings. So the humanities, if you haven't guessed, deal with humans and human life and meditating on what is a good life and what are virtues and what is beauty and these things. And to do this work, we need lots of money." This is what this report is saying. We need lots of money and institutional support. However, he who pays the pipers calls the tune. And the report is saying we need to be very careful who's funding this, because the perception of humanity that is our vocation can be manipulated by these concerns of patronage. The Commission's boldest recommendation was that a new publicly funded national foundation be established to dispense money to the humanities. But it also cautioned that this path was fraught. So getting money from the state was fraught, right? Because we have to separate ourselves from the intervening 60 years, right? There's been a tremendous disillusionment in the role of the state. You have to understand when they're writing, and indeed in this society, what is the state? It's supposed to be this neutral common ground. In the liberal capital L state, you have all the little guys pool their little authority, and that's the state, and that neutral common ground is going to be more powerful than any private institution and interest. And maybe you believe that, and maybe I don't, and maybe you don't, and maybe I do. It doesn't matter. The point is that that's the matrix of what the state is. And when this report was being put out in the 60s, this is before the real disillusionment of Vietnam and certain other scandals since then. A conga line of scandals, not the least of which was JFK. Well, actually, JFK was 63, so I guess they were just on the on the disillusionment train. But the point is there was a lot more, shall we say, idealism at play here. The report argued that although building the taxpayer-financed agency to support American arts and letters was necessary, no federal body should have a monopoly on this grant-making, lest the humanities become unduly influenced by politics. Quote, we must unquestionably increase the prestige of the humanities and the flow of funds to them. At the same time, however, grave the need for money, we must safeguard the independence, originality, and freedom of expression of all who are concerned with liberal learning. Liberal learning, right from the Liber, from the books. The liberal man is the man of books. It doesn't have a political connotation. Now, for a while, things seem to go more or less according to the Commission's plans. We're reading an article, by the way, from the Atlantic magazine concerning what the heck is the Carnegie Mellon Foundation doing with the National Council for the Humanities, National Endowment for the Humanities. It was President Lyndon B. Johnson, speaking about being disillusioned, curmudgeonly sons of guns, Lyndon Johnson, who was the one who established the National Endowment for the Humanities in 1965 in direct response to the report. A few years later, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation was created to finance American arts and letters. It would become part of a broader network that included the Ford Foundation, which began funding the humanities in the 50s, and the John Templeton Foundation, all these guys that you hear mentioned when you listen to PBS, right? You get the assembly list of all these foundations and things. The benefaction of these private nonprofits eventually come to exceed by a substantial margin the money dispensed by the government, which has, in fact, declined over the years. So you have this peculiar thing where you have a National Endowment for the Humanities established by the federal government, but most of its funding is coming from these giant trusts. In recent decades, though, the priorities of many of these nonprofits themselves have shifted. The Atlantic Philanthropies, a one-time stalwart, reduced its funding for the humanities in the 1990s. I wonder if that's connected to the publisher of this magazine, the Atlantic Philanthropies. The Rockefeller Foundation, you get a hiss whenever you hear the name Rockefeller. The Rockefeller Foundation began moving away from the humanities funding in the 2000s. In 2022, the Ford Foundation announced its plans to drastically reduce its higher education funding in order to focus on racial justice movement building, just in time, the Black Lives Matter and all this. With the broader ecosystem of humanities-focused philanthropies all but dried up, only one major private grant maker is left. Funny how that works. Today, no single entity, including the federal government, has a more profound influence on the fiscal health and cultural output of the humanities than the Mellon Foundation. The National Endowment for the Humanities budget was $78 million in 20 and 24. Mellon awarded $540 million in grants that same year. So, I mean, that's 5 times more, right? Actually, more than 5, but 7 times more. $78 million to $540 million. The Mellon's largesse is badly needed, especially as the Trump administration has threatened to further cut the NEH. But the Foundation's virtual monopoly on humanities funding means that it has the power to remake the entire field. In fact, that's plural. To remake entire fields according to its desire, right? So this is the danger of the who pays the piper calls the tune. Right? If you have you have a problem. Let's just recap here. You have a problem, even by the mid-20th century, that the humanities are being squeezed out of the attention of universities because you have all of these giant land-grant colleges and things being put up originally after the GI Bill and now with the baby boomers coming along. So you have all these schools opening up. What's happening is millions of middle-class kids, baby boomers, who would never have gone to college before, all of a sudden are showing up for the past 20 years, since the end of the Second World War. But they just want jobs. They just want job credentialing coming out of this. They don't have any ability to think in a higher, more sophisticated way. That puts the colleges in this strange dynamic where they're having to act as if they were market-driven things like companies. All right. So as a solution to that, in Johnson's Great Society, once he washed off all the blood from killing Kennedy, he gets all of these social reform things. This is where you get a whole bevy. It's almost like a second FDR. It's the second coming of FDR, Lyndon Johnson. And so you have all of these social welfare programs that are put into place, immigration reform or deform, as the case may be, yada yada yada, including the National Endowment of the Humanities, right? So we're going to solve this problem by having a state-funded place to get grants to solve the problem of funding that's not happening as it should be in the universities because they've kind of bellied into the private kind of commercial sphere. Okay. So now what ends up happening over decades now, 6 decades, is that this NEH becomes the go-to source if you need funding. Because the only way you can sit around researching things and learning languages and studying tribes and whatever is if you have grants. Tuition doesn't, if you don't know, tuition doesn't keep schools running. That doesn't mean you shouldn't pay tuition, by the way. But it does not keep the lights on. You have to have another funding source, and that's a whole other discussion. But the point is, as the years have gone on, the big foundations have moved into other things. Something that wasn't provided for in 1964 when this report came out was the sort of march through the institutions that leftists have engaged on, sometimes more organized in decades than others. And so that really does explain, well, one, why some of the foundations shift. They've been taken over. We saw kind of an apogee of that during the COVID years, right, with Black Lives Matter, with all sorts of rather niche academic interests getting popularized and politicized. Okay, so there's only one man standing, which is the Carnegie Mellon Foundation, that's basically running what's superficially this public national endowment for the humanities. Well, what happens if ideologues of any political stripe get into that? I mean, that's the only funding, and so you can, and this is what the authors here are saying, you can literally remake entire fields. You can remake subfields in history based off the ideologues that are writing the grants. You got to give it to the strategy. There is a method to the madness. It absolutely bears fruit. You saw that. I mean, you saw that in a different way, but it's the same mechanism. It's just a different field. You saw that with the takeover in the past decade of the human resources, where through controlling the human resource policy of companies, you could move forward certain social agendas. It's the same principle with this NEH here. So over the past decade, we read on, the conservative critics of higher education have tended to offer a rather simple explanation for the humanities' decline. Their argument amounts to a version of go woke, go broke. According to this theory, ultra-progressive faculty coalesced around unpopular liberal orthodoxy, turning off undergraduates and the public and accelerating the humanities' collapse. In short, Shakespeare was replaced by a jargon-laced prattle about settler colonialism, as one example, and students took their tuition dollars to more sane, less shrill corners of the university. But this tale, the editors write, places too much of the blame on humanities professors, overestimating their actual power within institutions. More important, the went woke, went broke hypothesis does not account for the ways that economic transformations within higher education have accelerated the trends that conservatives lament. Specifically, the right-wing theory of the case gets the causal arrow wrong. The humanities aren't broke because they went woke. The humanities went woke in large part because they were broke. As other donors, the government and universities themselves all but abandoned these fields for market reasons. I'm interjecting. These were market reasons. Carnegie Mellon Foundation became a lifeline But the foundation has proved to be, as Jacques Derrida might have said, a kind of pharmakon, a Greek word that the philosopher noted it could be translated either as remedy or poison, depending on your perspective. We say in America, colloquially, that the cure sometimes is worse than the disease. So I'm going to bring the bird down for this article. I leave it to you to read the rest of it. This is from The Atlantic, and it is entitled, What is the Mellon Foundation Doing in Higher Education by Tyler Austin Harper. So here we are, Apoc On Air, Mondays 10 a.m. Eastern on Revolution Radio Studio A. Just a reminder that this station is listener supported, so reach into your wallets and help them out. We transition now into the second half of our show, and we're looking at the 1920s, 1930s. This is the last weekend, or weekend, hey, where's my mind? The last week that we're going to be talking about this. Our third volume is concluding. We're entering the spring, and that means we're starting volume 4. If you want, and I should very much encourage this, you ought to go to ApocatastasisInstitute.wordpress.com/the-project. And when you do that, you will download the 5 volumes of our project. The project is our yearly look at human history on this earth. It is designed ultimately for lifelong repetitive reading and study, and for our graduated students, or just for adult learners in their private study, it's appropriate. And then more toward the purpose of the college here, it's also our core curricula in class, whether that's for our full-time enrolled students, our bi-monthly or monthly students, our Substack. We have a whole outreach using this unified curricula on Substack. If you take out a subscription for the Apocatastasis site, you get access to deep presentations on these topics, and they're actually in sync with what we're going over in these more cursory looks here on Revolution Radio. So if you want to go a little bit deeper, Substack is your man there. Check that out. And then deeper still with proper enrollment at the college. But in any case, this is a wide application, and we're ending volume 3, which is the second part of the Outline of History by H.G. Wells. We're going to check in with Wells here for the last time until the autumn. And volume 4 is going to look at actually critiques of Wells and critiques of a certain materialistic view of history from G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc. So that'll take us through the spring. And then in the summer, we'll be back on the chronology wagon looking at the world since 1945, and that'll take us right into the guts of September when we start again and do it again and again. Not that these 5 volumes altogether, 1 of poetry, 4 of these other meditations, are comprehensive. I don't pretend they are. The authors don't pretend they are. But the purpose is to provide a scaffolding for our classroom work, our private study, our radio broadcast, our Substack, to provide a scaffolding topically where we're at throughout the year. All right, so that's the project, and I'd like now to have our poetry section. We're continuing this week with a lengthy poem by William Butler Yeats, the Irish author. And this is entitled 1919. I'm going to begin on part 4. You can go back to last week's episode in the archives here on Revolution Radio to access the first part, or just look up the poem yourself, or do both. Part 4. 1919, William Butler Yeats. We who 7 years ago talked of honor and of truth shriek with pleasure if we show the weasel's twist, the weasel's tooth. 5. Come, let us mock at the great that had such burdens on the mind and toiled so hard and late to leave some monument behind, nor thought of the leveling wind. Come, let us mock at the wise with all those calendars whereon they fixed old aching eyes. They never saw how seasons run, and now but gape at the sun. Come, let us mock at the good that fancied goodness might be gay, and sick of solitude might proclaim a holiday. Wind shrieked, and where are they? Mockers after that would not lift a hand, maybe to help good, wise, or great, to bar that foul storm out, for we traffic in mockery. 6. Violence upon the roads, violence of horses. Some few have handsome riders are garlanded on delicate sensitive ear or tossing mane. But wearied running round and round in their courses, all break and vanish, and evil gathers ahead. Herodias' daughters have returned again, a sudden blast of dusty wind, and after thunder, feet tumult of images. Their purpose in the labyrinth of the wind, and should some crazy hand dare touch a daughter, all turn with amorous cries or angry cries according to the wind, for all are blind. But now wind drops, and dust settles there upon their lurches past as great eyes without thought, under the shadow of stupid straw-pale locks, that insolent fiend robber artisan, to whom the lovelorn Lady Kettler brought bronzed peacock feathers, red combs of her cocks. Tu autem Domine, miserere nobis. Thus is the second half of William Butler Yeats's 1919, describing the disillusion following the Treaty of Paris. H.G. Wells told us last week of the optimism of men like Woodrow Wilson, the optimism of men like T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. He described for us at the Treaty of Paris the carnival atmosphere as every Hindu and Chinaman and Eskimo and Tartar showed up in Paris in their national dress, vying for a new country, because the liberal principle of self-determination was the order of the hour. And so one of the ways people, groups at this time, were to prove the worth of and the quality of their claims for nationhood was to assert themselves in arms. And so it's very important to consider that whilst, yes, the First World War is quote-unquote over, you literally have dozens of local wars breaking out in Ireland, in Germany, in Italy, as we'll look at here with Mussolini and the black shirts. Russia, now part of the Soviet Union, is beset by 20 capitalist nations, Trotsky fighting them all off rather stupendously. This is a military observation. Trotsky was one of the real geniuses of the time, not that I'm blessing his political outlook or his behavior, which was sanguinary, to put it politely. But Trotsky is one of those sorts that could read a computer manual cold and then put a computer together, or read a military manual having never served a day of his life in the military and win battles. He had an almost preternatural genius to him, and defeats those 20 odd nations that are set against the infant Soviet Union. In the Orient, fights are breaking out in China between the nationalists and communists out there. Japan is arming and putting itself on a whole new footing altogether, and had been for some time, actually, since 1905. So you have all this going on, all this bloodshed happening. Spain will have its civil war soon enough. So it's really not a time of peace. But then you have Wilson and his lot showing up with this idealism, and Clemenceau Lloyd George and others, Victor Emmanuel from Italy, wanting vengeance. So it's a whole cacophony of interest, shall we say. Also in the Mideast, you have the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and with that, basically the colonization of different areas. We're living very much right now with the playings of that, all those lines you see on the map, the results of Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration and all this stuff. By the way, next week we're going to really kind of compare head-on some of the specifics in the 1920s and 30s with where we're at right now. I've alluded to this before, so before we transition to book 4, I'm going to have to renumber the books because I'm tripping over the numbering. Before we jump into book 4 of the project, which is something somewhat spiritual look at the role of religion and spirituality in history, kind of a adjunct to our more materialistic look here with H.G. Wells. Before we do that, we will kind of have a whole seminar next week, really putting these two periods together, seeing where they're similar, seeing where they're dissimilar, because as you know, on Revolution Radio here, many people have argued that we are now, and have been, in the Third World War. So it behooves us to see how the Second came about, and where those parallels are just and unjust. So I'm going to go here to page 882 from the Outline of History, volume 3, in our PDFs there that you can download. And we're going to learn about Mussolini, because the sort of dithering that you see at the Treaty of Paris and the cross purposes of the Treaty of Paris, this is not going to be satisfactory, especially in some of these nation states, which Spain, Italy, and Germany will have very, very definite pushbacks. In France, definitely, and to a somewhat lesser extent in England, you will have pushback in a different sort. So Italy, Spain, and Germany will have a right-wing pushback. France and Britain will have a more left-wing pushback. So a group of treaties, Wells begins this section 4. Embodied decisions of Versailles. We give here first a map of the territorial aspect of the peace treaty. Mr. Horrobin's lucid pen gives the essential facts much more plainly than any dissertation can do. In addition, it was stipulated that Germany should be extensively disarmed, should surrender her fleet, pay a great war indemnity, and great sums for the reparation of war damages. When we come back to our history consciousness here on Mondays and at the school in the summer, when we begin volume 5, The World Since 1945, we're actually going, that's the name of the book, but we're actually going to start with the rise of the Nazi Party and get into the blow by blow of the Second World War. So we're going to idle our engines here, but don't worry, we're not going to skip over Weimar and all of that interesting history. Anyhow, an Allied commission was to observe the disarmament of Germany after the Treaty of Paris. The fleet was to have been handed over to the British upon the 21st of June, 1919, but the officers and men aboard could not endure to do this, and instead scuttled and sank their ships at Scapa Flow within sight of the British. That's the big British naval base in Scotland, Scapa Flow. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up altogether, as was the Ottomans, I'll interject. And little Austria was left, pledged to not to unite with Germany. A clipped and mutilated Hungary, Romania, spelled R-O-U, mania, in this time, expanded far beyond its legitimate boundaries into Transylvania. Poland received most of Galicia. Bohemia, with Slovak and Moravian extensions, reappeared as Czechoslovakia. The Serbs, Croats, and Montenegrins became a new Yugoslav, or Southern Slav state, and at once fell into violent conflict with Italy over the port of Fiume, which the Italians quite unrighteously claimed. This is the section of the book where, when H.G. Wells first wrote this was, stuff on the news in his time. This initial book came out, I think, in 1922. This stuff is happening right away. The edition I have, incidentally, comes from 1961 and has a few extra chapters filling in the gaps. But anyway, this is also the time where H.G. Wells starts to be rather loquacious with his opinions. In fact, one of the ticklish things about this, with the perspective of 100 years, is the attention that H.G. Wells, the British author, gives to the Anglo-Irish War and Civil War. It's probably more than it deserves. however interesting, but in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it quite deserves the page numbers he gives it. But at the time, boy, was that a hot topic. Okay, the Turkish treaty was hard to make and impossible to enforce. I believe that was the Sen-Severin Treaty. A nominal Turkish government in Constantinople signed it, but a second real Turkish government established itself at Angora, we call that Ankara now, and refused to sign. Isn't that a sticky thing? What happens when you have two or more factions of these so-called peoples showing up saying that they're the legitimate government? Who gets to decide? It's a sticky thing. I'm just finished reading Churchill's Memoirs of the Second World War, and this similar thing happens in Poland and France and Italy. In France, to say nothing of France, who gets to decide? Well, it's not so hard at the Treaty of Paris as it is at Potsdam and things following the Second World War, because guess what? The Soviets aren't invited to the Treaty of Paris in 1919. They're persona non grata. They're like the Taliban now. Nobody was dealing with them. They were pretending the Soviet Union wasn't there. It's going to go away. It'll destroy itself. We don't have to listen to them. Yes, it reminds you right now of how the nations of the world are treating the Taliban, which obviously is a government, obviously is doing everything that a lawful government has ever done in human history, that is to say, controlling its borders and administering courts. But if you just ignore it, you can just pretend it'll go away. Or how the Catholic Church, for about 200 years, pretended that liberalism and democracy was going away. Then eventually you always have to just, cry uncle and deal with the new situation and keep it moving. But anyway, the question of the legitimacy of these people groups is made more simple than it would be a generation later after the Second World War, because you don't have these two ideological blocks. It's all just the liberal allies. The vitality of the Turk in this phase was remarkable. He was not only driving back the attacking Greeks. Greece, by the way, wanted all of their old cities on the west coast of what we call Turkey now. I guess we understand who won that conflict between the Turks and the Greeks. Yeah, Turkey wanted, all those Bible cities, like Pergamum and Philadelphia and Laodicea in the book of Revelation? Those are on the west coast of Turkey or Anatolia, and the Greek state wanted all of that, and they came to blows with the Turks, who ended up winning that little contest. Actually, if you look at the plans for Greece, it was actually far more extensive. They wanted a Cyprus, what was the other? I forgot the other island there. Rhodes. They wanted Rhodes, Cyprus, the whole west coast of Turkey. It was clearly a source of strength to the Turks rather than weakness that they were cut off altogether from their age-long, ineffective conflict with the Arab. Disagreement, of course, the British took great cares to exploit with T.E. Lawrence, setting the Arabs against the Turks. Syria and Mesopotamia were entirely detached from Turkish rule. Palestine was made a separate state within the British sphere, earmarked as a national home for the Jews, something we've been cursed with, this British decision, that is to say, since then. It's amazing how many ghosts that are haunting the world since 1919, and none more so than in the Middle East. We have all of these arbitrary lines that are supposed to be separating national groups and religious idealism, shall we say, with the Zionist Jews. We must talk about that whole topic because there's a whole other faction completely written out of history since the triumph of Zionism after World War II called the Bund and the Bundists. And these were European Jews that were perfectly content to stay in Europe because they were Europeans. And they were quite ascendant until the Second World War became a windfall for Zionism. For propaganda reasons, but we get ahead of ourselves. A flood of poor Jewish immigrants poured into the Promised Land, H.G. Wells says, and was speedily involved in serious conflicts with the Arab populations. whom they immediately began, I'm interjecting, dispossessing. The Arabs had been consolidated against the Turks and inspired with the conception of national unity through the exertions of a young Oxford scholar, Colonel Lawrence. His dream of an Arab kingdom with its capital at Damascus was speedily shattered by the hunger of the French and British for mandatory territory, and in the end, his Arab kingdom shrank to the vast, or rather, not to the vast, it shrank to the desert kingdom of the Hejaz, and various other small and insecure Emirates, sultanates, and imamates. Unity was come to Arabia not from the west, but from a revival of Muslim Puritans, the Wahhabis, led by a desert king, Ibn Saud. We don't have time here to get into the British politicking in the Middle East and the defeat, ultimately, of Colonel Lawrence's plans, because he had promised a completely different faction rulership of a vast Arab kingdom. And there's a great book called The War to End Peace. You can probably find it in your libraries. And it gets into a lot of the politicking when it comes to the Middle East. But Lawrence had promised, T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia, had promised one Hashemite faction from Mecca, sovereignty, basically, after the war, and a vast Arab kingdom from the northern borders of Iraq through Lebanon, all the way down through the Negev, all of Arabia, the Gulf countries. That whole area was supposed to be one single Arab kingdom. And then another faction of British from Cairo, if memory serves, swooped in and built up the Saud family and completely scuttled that plan. Incidentally, when Colonel Lawrence was at the Treaty of Paris in 1919 with the Arabs he had been working with and been promising this kingdom to, it was then that the Saud family struck. So while everyone's back was turned up in Paris, that's when the Wahhabis and the Saud family took over what we call Saudi Arabia today, but it was kind of a coup amongst the Arabs. It was not the original plan. The original descendants of that British plan are the royal family of Jordan today. King Abdullah. King Abdullah is and Jordan, the country, is the last of that. That's the rump of T.E. Lawrence's vision. And King Abdullah ought to be ruling over that whole landmass I mentioned before, basically everything from the northern border with Turkey all down to Iraq and Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and Arabia and the Gulf countries. All of that was supposed to be under King Abdullah's rule now, had history not happened, but so it has interjected itself, as it must always. All right, the last thing I want to look at here, returning to Europe in the 1920s, are the fascists, and I mean specifically the Italian party of that name. And so we're going to look at Benito Mussolini and the fascist march on Rome, 1922. Hitler doesn't have his putsch until 1924, and it's going to be quite a while, actually, before he rebuilds the party from that disaster in order to take power in 1933. Mussolini's the first man, and in fact, a lot of the aesthetic and attitude of the NSDAP, which itself, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, a lot of that branding and rebranding comes about through inspiration from the fascists. So this article comes from the Warfare History Network, and it's subtitled, "A Worried King Victor Emmanuel Questioned the Trustworthiness of Benito Mussolini on the Eve of the Fascist March on Rome." This is by Blaine Taylor. On March 23rd, 1919, but 4 months after the armistice that ended the Great War, 100 young toughs, ex-Italian Army War veterans, former socialist politicians, newspapermen, met in Milan's Piazza San Sepolcro in industrial northern Italy to form a new political party. These were the fascists, and they numbered over 300,000 members by the fall of 22. Mussolini had served in the First World War as a combat-wounded bersagliere, a member of one of Italy's most elite formations. These Italian shock troops, however, were far more colorful than their German cousins, the stormtroopers of 1918, reportedly going into battle armed with daggers clenched in their teeth, these Italian stormtroopers, and grenades in both hands. That sounds scary as hell. On the very heels of artillery barrages, so as to take the unsuspecting Austro-Hungarian enemy by total surprise. More than half of the Arditi's members were tough peasant boys, while the very meaning of the word ardito was audacious man. They wore fearsome skull and crossbone caps. Sound familiar? They gave stiff-armed Roman salutes with unsheathed daggers and chanted, "To us." Not only did Mussolini, then the editor of a fiery newspaper called The People of Italy, adopt all of these martial trappings for his new fascist party, but 25 Arditi soldiers guarded his offices in Milan. And 4 times they burned down those of the rival socialist paper, the Avanti. So Mussolini is quite interesting, and like a lot of people in the 1920s and 30s, he whipsaws from one extreme to another. So you have a kind of lukewarm, increasingly lukewarm liberal peace, represented by Paris and the Treaty of Paris, and the sub-treaties, of which the Treaty of Versailles is the most infamous, and the League of Nations. We'll talk a lot about that next week as we're comparing situation then to now. We're going to really look at that next week. You have this sort of lukewarm, uninspiring situation, and then you have the appeal of more earnest groups on the left, especially the communists, and then on the right. And as it regards Mussolini, he's originally a socialist, and then whipsaws into this brand new thing called fascism. And we might say, and we must lay this out much more when we revisit all of this time period in the summer, what is a fascist, or what designates a fascist from a communist? And there's a few things that we can identify, but one that's appropriate here is that the traditional left-wing focus on the working class and internationalism is turned inwards to the nation. That would be one of the real defining differences. And with that, you have a rise of consciousness in the nation, what makes us different from them, and enter in all sorts of historical mythology, depending on the country, language, foci, and all sorts of things that, in a sense, you really can't have with internationalism. Or if you are, you're kind of coming up with this ideal future internationalist man. The appeal of the fascists, whether that's the formal Italian party of that name or the other nations' parties of that affiliation, the appeal of fascism, one is that you already have a living tradition within your nation of who you are. You have a language, you have a religion, you have an ethnos, presumably, however damaged by the First World War. You have a lot more to work with in terms of a living reality, as opposed to having to, in a sense, project into the future. That's why you have especially in Italy, and with the whole nonsense of the Port of Fiume, and who gets to have the city of Fiume in the Adriatic. Is it going to be Italy or Yugoslavia? And that's how you get Gabriel D'Annunzio and his futurists. And that's another aspect of fascism we can look at in the future, is this cobbling together of seemingly not just unrelated but somewhat contradictory factions. So you have hardened traditionalists and oftentimes monarchists and things becoming fascists, and futurists and socialists in the case of Mussolini. It's quite a hodgepodge. And also part of the attraction of fascism is this brand new thing that is neither liberal nor socialist. They shared the anguish these new fascists, and what the poet, war pilot, and political activist Gabriele D'Annunzio defined as liberal Italy's mutilated victory in the First World War that denied it the fruits of victory. One of these was the Adriatic seaport of Fiume in the new state of Yugoslavia, which all Italians felt should rightly become the spoils of victorious Italy. On September 12, 1919, D'Annunzio led a small force of former Arditi in a swift occupation of Fiume in opposition to the Italian government of King Victor Emmanuel III, who had been on the throne since the assassination of his father in 1900. Again, this is the same idea of showing yourself in arms that you're seeing all across the so-called post-war world, that you see again and again, that a group of people to claim the self-determination that is now going to be the defining principle of what makes you a people and makes you worthy of having a nation. You have to do this sort of thing, especially what Gabriele D'Annunzio does, which is to take over a city, to assert yourself in arms, and to drive off anyone who would contest that, because that's proving that you are serious about self-determination. Nevertheless, it was imperative that the king, who at 5 foot 3 inches in height, was nicknamed contemptuously the Little Sword. No king wants to be called the Little Sword. To reassert his authority, as among both the ranks of the Arditi and other fascists were many Republicans, liberals, who wanted nothing better than to see the antiquated 900-year-old ruling House of Savoy swept away, as it finally was by popular vote after World War II. The king's most ardent supporters were the royalist officers of the Italian army, but even many of these had fascist sympathies. Benito Mussolini, from socialist to fascist, we continue reading. Initially, ex-socialist Mussolini had been one of those fiery Republicans, asserting, quote, the king is nothing more than a useless citizen. And in 1912, he made even more anti-nationalist proclamation. The Italian flag, he says, is fit only for the dung heap. During D'Annunzio's Fiume occupation, D'Annunzio and El Duce, Mussolini, who had united all fascists around his person under the spell of his fiery oratory and inflammatory newspaper editorials, several times discussed the possibility of a joint march on Rome to seize political power by simply taking the capital by force, and that's that principle of self-determination, and kicking out the long-time Liberal Party cabinet. The main question was, what would the king, the army, and the Carbonari do? All right, so we're going to bring down the bird here, looking at a response, a reply to the type of lukewarm order that was established after World War I with the League of Nations. You have the rise of these other parties, very muscular communists, and here fascists starting to rise up. Anyway, I'll catch you next week here on Revolution Radio, listener supported, at 10 a.m. Eastern for Apoc On Air. Take care, everyone.
Truth breaks the spell and information never sleeps. Tune into Revolution Radio, where truth breaks the spell and information never sleeps. Never sleeps. Revolution Radio, where truth breaks the spell and information never sleeps.
Did you ever feel that things were not quite right? That everything was just ever so slightly askew?
Do you have, to paraphrase Morpheus, a splinter in your mind?
If you're interested in hearing the latest information about UFOs, the paranormal,
ancient cultures and structures,
monatomic elements,
longevity,
fantastic discoveries in science,
download it to your brain,
then tune into us. Hi, I'm Dave.
But I'm Mackie.
And we are Shiny Side Out, Sundays 2 to 4 a.m. Eastern. See you then.
Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.